There's a house at the end of Willowmere Street where a single window glows softly every evening, long after the neighborhood has settled into sleep. If you happen to pass by on a quiet night, you might see the silhouette of someone sitting at a desk, pen moving across paper in steady, deliberate strokes. The house belongs to Eleanor Hartley, and what she does there is both simple and extraordinary. She writes letters. Not emails or text messages, but actual letters, the kind written by hand on quality paper, folded carefully into envelopes, sealed with wax when the occasion calls for it. Letters to people she knows and people she's never met. Letters that arrive unexpectedly in mailboxes and somehow always say exactly what the recipient needs to hear. Tonight, Eleanor sits at her writing desk as she does every evening, surrounded by the comfortable disorder of her craft. Stacks of stationery in various shades: cream, pale blue, soft gray. Bottles of ink arranged by color. A collection of vintage fountain pens, each one chosen for a different purpose, a different mood. The lamp beside her casts a warm circle of light that makes everything feel both intimate and infinite. She's writing to someone named Margaret, a woman she met briefly at a garden center 3 weeks ago. They'd both reached for the same packet of forget-me-not seeds, laughed about it, exchanged a few words about spring planting. Margaret had mentioned, almost casually, that she'd recently lost her husband, that their garden had been his domain, and she wasn't sure she could tend it alone. Eleanor had asked for her address. Margaret had seemed surprised but had written it down on the back of a receipt. Now Eleanor writes, "Dear Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the garden, about how it feels different now, tending it alone. I wonder if you might consider that the garden remembers his care, that the soil still holds the imprint of his attention." Eleanor came to letter writing late in life, though looking back, she can see how everything led to this. She'd been a teacher for 35 years, mostly elementary school, where she'd spent countless hours helping children form their letters, construct their sentences, find their voices on the page. She'd loved that work, the patient nurturing of young minds learning to express themselves. But it was after retirement, in the sudden spaciousness of unscheduled days, that she'd discovered her true calling. She'd started writing letters to former students, just brief notes letting them know she remembered them, was proud of them, wondered how they were. The responses that came back had surprised her, not just in their warmth but in their hunger. So many people, it seemed, were starved for genuine connection, for words that felt personal and considered and real. So she'd expanded her practice. She began writing to neighbors, to acquaintances, to friends of friends who someone mentioned might need encouragement. She wrote to elderly people in care homes, to young mothers overwhelmed by new responsibilities, to anyone who seemed to be carrying something heavy. And somehow word spread. Now people leave notes in her mailbox, slipped under her door, tucked into her garden gate. Brief messages. "Could you write to my sister? She's going through a divorce." Or, "My father just moved into assisted living. He feels forgotten." Sometimes just a name and an address, trusting Eleanor to know what to say. She never refuses. Every evening, she sits at her desk and writes, choosing her words the way a gardener chooses seeds. Carefully, hopefully, with faith in what might grow. Margaret's letter continues. Eleanor writes about continuity, about how love doesn't disappear but transforms, becomes part of the landscape we inhabit. She writes about the courage it takes to tend something that reminds us of loss, and how that very act is a form of honoring. Her handwriting is clear and unhurried, each word given its proper space. When she finishes, she reads it through once, checking not for errors but for tone. Does it offer comfort without dismissing grief? Does it acknowledge difficulty while suggesting possibility? Satisfied, she folds the letter, slides it into an envelope, addresses it in her careful script. She'll mail it tomorrow, along with the 6 other letters she's written this week. But first, she takes a moment to look out her window at the quiet street beyond. The houses are mostly dark now, their inhabitants dreaming or trying to. She wonders about their interior lives, their private struggles and small joys. She wonders if any of them know how much they matter, how their existence ripples outward in ways they can't see. This is what her letters try to say in various ways. You matter. You're seen. You're not alone. The practice of letter writing has taught Eleanor things she didn't learn in 3.5 decades of teaching. This taught her about patience. Real patience, the kind that doesn't expect immediate results or even any results at all. Some letters receive responses. Many don't. She writes them anyway, trusting that words have their own journey, their own timing. This taught her about attention. To write a good letter, you have to really see the person you're writing to, consider their particular situation, their specific heart. You can't write from a template. Each letter must be as unique as the person receiving it, must carry the imprint of genuine care. And it's taught her about hope. Not the naive kind that expects everything to turn out perfectly, but the stubborn kind that insists beauty and connection are possible even in difficult circumstances. Maybe especially in difficult circumstances. She pulls out a fresh sheet of paper. The next letter is for someone named David, a recently divorced father of 2 who's struggling with loneliness. His sister had left Eleanor a note explaining the situation, asking if she might write to him. Eleanor thinks for a moment, her pen poised above the paper, waiting for the right opening words. They come. Dear David, your sister tells me you're navigating a difficult transition. I wanted you to know that someone you've never met is thinking of you this evening, hoping you're being gentle with yourself. The lamp flickers slightly. The bulb is old, will need replacing soon, but steadies again. Eleanor continues writing, her words forming a bridge across distance and strangeness. She tells David that loneliness is not a failure but a doorway, that the empty spaces in our lives are where new things can grow if we let them. She writes about small pleasures, the satisfaction of cooking a good meal for yourself, the way morning light looks different in each season, the quiet pride of being present for your children even when you feel broken. She writes until the letter feels complete, until she can sense she's said what needed saying. Then she sets it aside to dry. She always uses a fountain pen, and the ink needs time and reaches for another blank sheet. This one is for a woman named Claire who recently lost her mother. Claire's best friend had contacted Eleanor, worried because Claire had stopped answering calls, stopped going to work, was disappearing into her grief in a way that frightened the people who loved her. Eleanor understands this kind of grief. She lost her own mother 12 years ago, and the hole it left was so vast she thought she might fall into it and never climb out. What had saved her was the small, persistent practice of continuing. Making breakfast, washing dishes, writing one sentence and then another. Not because she felt better, but because the act of continuing itself became a form of meaning. She writes to Claire about this, about how grief doesn't shrink, but we grow around it, learning to carry what felt impossible to carry. About how there's no timeline for healing, no correct way to miss someone. About how sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply survive another day, and how that alone is enough. Outside, a car passes slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across Eleanor's window. She glances up briefly, then returns to her letter. The house is completely quiet except for the soft scratch of pen on paper, the occasional creak of her chair, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. This quiet is something Eleanor has come to cherish. In her teaching years, her days were full of noise, children's voices, bells ringing, announcements over intercoms. She'd loved that energy, had drawn purpose from it. But this quiet feels different. Feels like the kind of space where deeper things can surface, where you can hear the small, still voice that gets drowned out by daily commotion. Her letters emerge from this quiet. They carry it with them, she hopes, like a tuning fork transmitting a particular frequency. When someone opens one of her letters, she wants them to feel this same sense of spaciousness, this reminder that stillness exists and is available to them. She finishes Claire's letter and sets it with the others. Her hand aches slightly, arthritis, the price of age and repetitive motion, but it's a familiar ache, almost comforting in its predictability. She flexes her fingers, rotating her wrist, then checks her list. 2 more letters tonight. One for a young man named Alex who's struggling with anxiety, written at his therapist's suggestion. One for an elderly woman named Rose who lives alone and whose children rarely visit. Eleanor pulls out 2 fresh sheets of paper, considers each recipient, and begins again. For Alex, she writes about courage. Not the dramatic kind featured in movies, but the everyday kind it takes to get out of bed when your mind is telling you everything is terrible. The courage to ask for help, to keep trying different solutions until you find what works, to forgive yourself for being human and imperfect and afraid. She writes about her own experience with worry, how it had plagued her in her 40s, stealing sleep and joy and presence. How she'd learned, slowly and imperfectly, to question the stories her mind told, to distinguish between actual danger and imagined catastrophe. How she'd discovered that feelings, even overwhelming ones, are temporary weather patterns, not permanent conditions. You're doing better than you think you are, she writes to Alex. The fact that you're seeking help, that you're willing to try, that you're still here fighting, that's everything. That's the whole game. For Rose, she writes something different. She writes about visibility, about how aging can feel like slowly disappearing from the world's notice. How hard it is when the people who once needed you desperately now seem to barely remember you exist. She writes about worth that doesn't depend on usefulness, about the quiet dignity of a life fully lived. And then she does something she doesn't always do. She includes a small piece of herself. She tells Rose about her own fears of irrelevance, about the letters she writes as a way of insisting that connection matters, that every person deserves to be seen and valued and remembered. I see you, Rose, she writes. Your life matters. The fact that you've survived this long, weathered what you've weathered, persisted through everything that tried to diminish you, that's remarkable. You're remarkable. It's past midnight when Eleanor finally seals the last envelope. Her desk is covered with letters ready to be mailed, each one a small act of faith, a message cast into the world with no guarantee it will land where it's needed or be received in the spirit it's offered. But that's true of everything, isn't it? Every kindness, Every attempt at connection is a risk, a vulnerable reaching across the space that separates us from each other. We can never know for certain if our words will matter, if our care will be felt, if what we offer will be enough. We offer it anyway. That's what being human requires. Eleanor stands, feeling the stiffness in her knees, the weight of her 73 years. She turns off the lamp, and the room falls into darkness except for the streetlight's glow filtering through the curtains. She gathers her letters, tonight's crop of small hopes and careful words, and places them in her bag to mail tomorrow. Before leaving the room, she pauses at the window and looks out at Willowmere Street. The houses are dark and silent, their inhabitants deep in sleep or lying awake with their private worries and dreams. She thinks about all the interior lives unfolding behind those walls, all the stories being lived, all the hearts doing their best to stay open in a world that often feels too hard. I'm writing to you, she thinks, not to anyone in particular, but to all of them, to everyone trying to make sense of this strange and difficult and beautiful business of being alive. I'm writing to tell you that you're seen, that you matter, that someone is thinking of you in the quiet hours, hoping you're okay. And tomorrow, some of her letters will arrive in mailboxes like small miracles, like evidence that someone, somewhere, cares enough to put pen to paper and reach across the distance with words chosen carefully, offered freely, given without expectation of return. Eleanor turns away from the window and heads upstairs to bed. Her work is done for tonight. Tomorrow she'll write again, and the night after that, and the night after that. For as long as her hands can hold a pen and her heart can imagine the particular loneliness of strangers who need to know they're not as alone as they feel. Outside, the street remains quiet. Inside, the letters wait to be sent, each one a small light offered to someone sitting in darkness, each one saying in its own way, "You're here. I'm here." That connection, however fragile, is real and true and enough.